The interior of spaceships is also architecture. Architecture is organisation of space, and projecting of interiors is the architectural aim.
The Interplanetary Podcast. The exploration of space, for the benefit of all humankind. Your hosts in Devon and Guildford, George and Matthew Russell.
Oh yeah,
babies. Interiors.
Galina Balashova, or interiors. Hi, George.
Hi.
Have you been enjoying the week so far?
Yeah, the week so far is good.
An apology to the listeners. This is out a day late, which actually worked out quite well because Eric Berger mentioned the Interplanetary podcast in his article yesterday about why Ariane 5 delivered the James Webb Telescope into such a brilliant orbit. So we got a shout out by Ars Technica and Eric Berger yesterday.
Nice.
In fact, the article was citing Rudiger Albat directly from the podcast. So we got a bit of a scoop there, George. Which is not bad, is it?
Yeah,
so that was I was pretty chuffed with that. So thank you, Eric, and go check out that article. It's very well, or go check out the podcast and have a listen because that was a great interview. No interview this week. It's going to be a quick one because it's been a busy start to term. George, I'm going to give a shout out to the patrons. Long overdue. We've got the awesome Patreons that give enough to me that they get a shout out at the beginning of the show, and they are legends. And as always, it's the two Justins, Justin Roberts and Justin Young, but also Sigmund Eade and Drew Wright. So that's Australia, the UK, Norway, and Texas. That's cool, isn't it?
That is
all
really
over
cool.
the world, literally all corners of the world covered there. So I'm pretty chuffed. I shall shout out the glorious rest of the posse at the end of the show. A quick show today. I think anyone who knows who Galina Balashova, which isn't enough people, by the way, but anyone who does know that will go, oh, yes, we're going to have an episode about space architecture.
This doesn't get talked about a lot, but it's an important one.
It is, isn't it? And what I don't mean by space architecture is space flight mission architecture, which is very different. Really, the architectural practice.
The aesthetics of spacecraft.
Well, yeah, making it humanizing it, making it good for making humans able to kind of interact with it correctly. And there's lots of architectural theories, and I won't go into them. We have had them before on the show when we've talked to architects with space habitats, for example. But I thought it was really interesting, and I think Galina kind of needs a massive shout out here. Because when you think of design of rockets, like spacecraft and things like that, you're kind of bringing forward quite a few disciplines. So what do you think those disciplines are normally when you're sort of designing rockets, George?
I'd say mathematics, chemistry, engineering, physics, and aeronautics.
Oh, aeronautics, yes. I mean, obviously mathematics is required across all of it, including architecture, I guess. But yes, astronautics, system engineering, comms engineering, computer engineering, software engineering, electrical engineering, thermal engineering.
Plumbing.
Of course, plumbing, bit of propulsion, mechanical engineering, all those stresses and stuff. You're pushing materials to the absolute edge. As we heard last week from Rudiger, that it's every time you fly a rocket, you're getting all this new data because you're pushing everything to the absolute edge of where it's got to go to. These are massive engineering challenges across all of those disciplines. But here's the really interesting thing, and I think an architect listening to this will kind of have the same sort of thought that our space legend of the week, Galina, had, and that's that engineers have a sort of completely different mindset from architects because they only design the whole through individual components. So the individual components of something is like, well, we need a processor. Look at your computer. It's got a processor in it. It's got a video card in it. It's got a motherboard, and all those sort of things come together to make the look of your computer.
But I mean, Intel didn't talk with NVIDIA when they were designing their, that current generations.
Well, they may have had a little chat, but they don't really have an architect to make it maybe look more beautiful. Maybe that is something that Apple probably did more of. They had a sort of more design approach, that they worried about what the whole looked like more than just the components. But normally engineers left to their own devices will sort of build up something from individual components. So, the construction of the whole is of secondary importance. Even like the James Webb Telescope, for example, its design is really based on how you can stuff it under the fairing of an Ariane 5. It's got to be...
Yeah, the satellite was designed around the rocket, not the other way around.
Yeah, exactly. The rocket isn't designed around James Webb, and James Webb is designed around the rocket, but only in an engineering sense and less an architectural sense. Of course, it doesn't really need architecture in that sense because it doesn't contain any humans and things like that. Although there is definitely an aesthetic, isn't there, to the James Webb Space Telescope? But I should imagine that the aesthetic is very secondary to the technical aspects.
If aliens put it in a museum, we do want them to see something that's quite cool. We don't want them just like to have this artifact that is like really important, but it looked really terrible.
Yeah, but a lot of spacecraft do look really terrible. Like the lunar lander just looks like a bunch of piping.
I think it's quite cool.
It's quite cool, but it does look like a bunch of piping and scaff poles covered in tin foil.
It's ironic though, Dad.
Oh, it's okay. It's ironically cool.
It's like a neo.
So, anyway, so space architecture, right? You've got this theory and practice of designing inhabited environments in outer space. So, and there are quite a few institutions now that sort of take this really seriously. So there was a mission statement for space architecture developed at the World Space Congress, for example, in Houston, 2002. 2002 is quite late, isn't it? By members of the Technical Aerospace Architectural Subcommittee of the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. So, that architectural approach is being taken really seriously. So it must include physiology, psychology, and sociology, as well as aerospace engineering in all those things that I mentioned. I mean, obviously, there was really early proponents of this stuff. You had Tsiolkovsky, who was designing spacecraft and looking at the architecture and how humans might live in it. And you've got von Braun also doing things like building space stations that would then, if you think about 2001 A Space Odyssey and the space station in that, it very much comes out of the architectural designs of von Braun. He's not just an engineer, he kind of is an architect of space, as was Tsiolkovsky. These are sort of visionary people, slightly more, I guess they're more cross-discipline than your average rocket engineer. An interesting thing, a lot of people think that the start of space architecture is when a guy called Raymond Loewy was worked at NASA, and against all the objections of engineers, in 1968, he managed to persuade NASA to include an observation window on the Skylab laboratory. Right, and that's 1968 is considered the start of space architecture. Where the architects are winning over the engineers and thinking about the psychological dimension of spacecraft design. But what do you think? Do you think that's true, or do you think we have a slightly American-centric view on things?
I mean, I don't know. The psychological aspect's quite important because you have to keep your just as much as you need like life support, for example, to clean the air, to give your astronauts water. If they're going mental and crashing, or like doing things wrong that lead to the mission failure, that's just as bad. So just as much as you need like life support and stuff, well, maybe not just as much, but equal to that fact, you also need to keep your astronauts sane. And one way to do that is to have good architecture, to not walls and things that are like colours that make you go insane.
Depressingly riveted walls.
Coloured the same colour that cigarette packets are.
Riveted walls that aren't riveting, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
So, obviously Yuri Gagarin didn't really have any architectural influence on his space capsule. He really is just strapped down to a deck chair and sent into orbit in a metal ball. And he's not really going anywhere, and it doesn't last very long. But the Russians knew that after Vostok and Voskhod, which were the kind of successors, when they wanted to get to Soyuz, they were thinking much more about the Soyuz module actually having a habitation module or an orbital module that would require the astronaut to maybe get out of his chair and do stuff.
But on the Soyuz is that little ball thing above the actual capsule.
And the remarkable thing is, of course, Soyuz really is the first spacecraft to employ a space architect. Now, the reason why I think that we think of Raymond Loewy in 1968 as being the first space architect is because poor old Galina Balashova, she wasn't allowed to say anything until the collapse of Russia and perestroika and all those state secrets being revealed. She would have been in violation of state secrets had she had spoken up and said, well, actually, I was doing all this stuff. I mean, Galina Balashova was basically called in to help with Soyuz. So let me give you a bit of a background. She's born in Kolomna and educated at the Moscow Architectural Institute, and actually started her career as an architect in 1955. And a lot of her work was removing decorative items from decadent residential buildings. It's kind of at the start of that kind of brutalism and getting rid of all that stuff that represented the bourgeoisie, I guess.
In concrete and that's it.
Yeah. How dare you? How dare you want to make your home look pretty?
Brutalism does look cool, though. You got to.
Yeah, no, I love it. Yeah, no, I like it. So in 1957, she became a senior architect at a department of the Russian state called the OKB-1, and of course, everyone who's a space nerd knows what that department is. It is the department that was responsible for the Soviet space program. So it's actually, full title is Special Design Bureau Number 1 of RD Institute Number 88. Now, I know that's really hard to get your head around, but in Russian, that translates to OKB-1 of N11-88. But anyway, and this was actually Korolov's design bureau. He was the first kind of boss. So Korolov, the great architect of the Russian space age. And, the first thing he did was Sputnik, of course, that is the start of the space age. And then Yuri Gagarin's Vostok 1. Absolutely amazing. And now that company is known as PAO S.P. Korolev Rocket and Space Corporation Energia, which, as many of you know, boils down in Russian to RSC Energia, RKK Energia, Energia being Russian for energy. And of course, that is the big Russian space industry. That is pretty much all of the Russian space industry, and it's been renationalized as of like 2008 or something, 11 maybe. So that's been responsible for all the big Russian stuff. She's working for the historical Russian Space Agency, basically, and so she's working there initially to design the residence for all the employees. But then she actually gets asked to join up and start helping out with the spacecraft. So she is the only woman in the history of outer space to have played a key role in designing 4 generations of spacecraft. So she helped with the design, not just helped, but like a serious participant in the Soyuz, the Mir space station, Salyut, which of course is part of the International Space Station, and of course the Russian equivalent of the space shuttle, the Buran.
I think we need justice for the Buran as well. Like, it's better than the space shuttle, you got to admit.
I don't have to admit anything, but it is very cool in the fact that it could be completely robotic. It didn't need, unlike the space shuttle.
Although I suppose the space shuttle recovering the main engines is probably its main benefit.
Which is better than SLS that chucks those brilliantly designed, probably the best ever rocket engines ever made, and chucks them into the sea, which was the whole point of the space shuttle, that it didn't have to
that's actually what it's all designed around, is keeping those engines not in the sea.
Not in the sea. And SLS is determined to dump them in the sea. It's really more of them each time. Brilliant. Well, anyway, she retired at the collapse of the...
One more each time as well.
Yeah, she actually retired at the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And at that point, all her work suddenly became available to the public because it's no longer a state secret. So it all kind of started after Yuri Gagarin and a few of the other kind of space, Tereskova and all those kind of people going up in the predecessors to Soyuz. They were looking at Soyuz, and the design prototype was given to Korolev in a kind of wooden model. And Sergei Pavlovich was totally enraged by this model and said, this is garbage. We need to find a better solution, and we need to find it this week. Which is pretty scary. So Konstantin Petrovich Feoktistov thought that it needed an artist and a sort of artistic flair to it. So Viktor Petrovich Duyamin, who was an artist, was asked to do that design, but he realized that it was much more of a sort of planning task. In other words, it's not like a designer's task. This is an architect's task. And so he knew Galina, who was the senior architect of the firm. So she was out there designing the buildings for where the employees lived. And he said, well, why don't you go see Galina, and she'll be able to do something. So Galina was invited over, but they had to meet in the stairwell because they weren't allowed to go into each other's offices because it was all top secret. And she was asked to design this habitation module as soon as possible. So she took it home for the weekend, and she converted all the different bits into she took her architectural flair and did things like converted one of the compartments left of the entry hatch into a savant, which is a type of cabinet with equipment in. And then she put the toilet in the right place. She put a divan right next to the entry hatch and things like that. And she brought these sketches, and this was passed on to Korolev, who was so impressed. He said, "Right, that's it. This is how we're going to build. This is how we're going to build it according to your design. Can you go off and make sure that it's gets done?" And so this is all done in watercolors, and her watercolors are really cool. What do you think about that?
I think it's insane that people can do those kinds of drawings and in watercolor and stuff. Because you got to remember that the interior of these the Russian style kind of Soyuz rockets are like a sphere or a cylinder. It's very hard to kind of draw, like just imagine, let alone draw, like how you're going to put cupboards and things in a sphere, and seats and a toilet and things.
And I'm very impressed with architects, because they not only are they kind of, it's not an artistic thing. They have to understand materials and the way people move around and how the colours and everything are going to affect everything.
Well, it's kind of like UI design. It's like it's part art, but then also you need to understand programming and just generally what's quick, what works.
Yeah, it's a discipline that requires lots and lots of skill sets all to come together, isn't it? And obviously Galina must have been essentially a genius, because this sketch she's done over the weekend is perhaps the most influential sketch, architectural sketch when it comes to, spacecraft ever. they built full-sized models from metal instead of wood based on her drawings. And so she would go down and she would occasionally say, I don't like that, I don't like that. And she would make sure that it was better done. But then Korolev, as this was being done, phoned her up and said, I need it to look more modern. I want the interior to look more modern. So she drew up 2 variants. And the only real difference was one was pale blue and yellowish, and the other was greyish green and brown.
The classic Soyuz interior colour.
The classic greyish green and brown of when you see Soyuz. And I've often thought, what is it about like the Russian architecture always has that style to it?
It's always like a dark green or like a pale yellow.
And that comes from Galina. I've got Galina, a really nice book, Architect of the Soviet Space Program, and it's got lots of pictures of her drawings and color swabs and things like that.
So she came up with that style of that color, because that is in like all Russian spacecraft from that point were colored in that color scheme.
Yeah, and Korolev loved that particular color scheme. There is some. I haven't found the citation for this, but someone suggested that green was chosen so that the television sets at the time would more likely produce the color truthfully, and so that when they were filming inside, it would look more realistic. But I couldn't really find evidence for that, but I'm willing to accept it. So yeah, I mean, so they actually built these things up, and you know that was it. You know, they ended up just as the Soyuz spacecraft. These interiors, and there's an extra bit to this. Is she used to in the designs? There's these beautiful murals located by the handrails inside the spacecraft, and one of the engineers, Anatoly Afanasov. He sort of said, well, where are the pictures coming from? Who's making the pictures? So Galina herself would go home and she would do these watercolor pictures based on, you know, holidays with her parents and scenes from the Black Sea and her garden in Lobna and things like that. And she would, you know, do these little paintings. But none of those paintings exist, annoyingly, because they're burnt up in the spacecraft when it comes in for a landing. It's annoying, isn't it?
Yeah, that is really annoying because you want to see like that's a part of history almost, you know.
It's a mega
but just
part.
Just
of
think
history.
how many paintings from, you know, Da Vinci or you know, like so many paintings from the past are just we just never will see.
We'll never see, and this kind of has to go along with it. There's all these fantastic pictures that went up with the early Soyuz spacecraft that were part of the interiors of the spacecraft. These little pictures of her garden and stuff like that. We'll never see them. We'll never see what they look like. But of course, for her and the astronauts, they're going to be completely imprinted on their memory. I bet you could get old Alexei Leonov before he died and said, can you remember what your little painting was like? And he would go, yeah, it looked like this. And then start to describe some scene from the window of Galina's apartment in Podlipka.
It's already quite the same as seeing the painting, though.
No, it's not quite the same as seeing the painting. Oh, Alexei Leonov, of course, he could have repainted it himself. So it could have been Alexei Leonov's transcription of Galina Balashova's original painting. Never mind.
Why didn't they put the murals on the inside of the spacecraft?
Well, it was, but but that bit of the spacecraft is the bit that sort of comes off and gets burnt up.
Oh, like it was part of this. That's the ball at the top of it that comes off.
Yeah, so it's the bit that unfortunately,
the crew. What's it called? Like the crew module or something?
The orbital module. Which was originally called the habitation module. Yeah, and then it was. I would imagine. I wonder if she kept any spare.
Surely she did a draft before doing the final thing.
No, I think she's just one of those artists that could knock out really nice, you know, watercolor drawings and paintings.
How was it transposed onto the spacecraft? Surely it was like a vinyl or something, and maybe the original was still there.
The way that she did a lot of this stuff was the way that the colours actually work to give the astronauts an orientation. So the sort of darker colours are nearer the floor and the lighter colours are going near the top. And that's, all those kind of elements to what she's doing. But, she would have been in charge of, choosing materials and stuff like that. And so a lot of the colours, I guess, may have been dictated. A lot of the, like the way that, like you said, the way that all the kind of metal parts are painted in that certain green, maybe that might actually be what the supplier can actually give you at the time.
Yeah, if you think back to things in the 60s and 70s, like toys from that era, when they're, plastic toys, they're always a slight tint.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, but because they actually can't make the different colours, because of the technology and material science, etc., etc.
But they still do it, so they must have stuck around.
But she was in charge of lighting as well, so she would have chosen, how the spacecraft was lit, what kind of bulbs and how it was, how it was going to be done and all those kind of things. So she really is an absolute trailblazer. So it's a shame, isn't it? I think she definitely needs. She is the space legend of the week.
Oh, only of the week?
Me. Only of the week. Yeah, we'll have another space legend next week. Don't worry.
What happens if midway through the week, like, somebody stops an asteroid single-handedly with a homemade rocket? Do we have to change space legend of the week, or we just reschedule to the next one?
No, we just have to keep rescheduling.
Okay.
Yeah, that's that. There is one last thing that we should mention about Galina, and that is she designed the one thing that you might recognize of hers is the Apollo Soyuz test program official emblem, which sort of came out in 1973, which was handed out on lapel pins. And she actually never had a name attached to it. And one of the reasons was that her name was a state secret. You're not allowed to have it. But also her superiors would be enraged by the fact that she was taking artistic credit for the Apollo Soyuz test program badge, because they've basically, it's their intellectual property, because it's like, we asked you to do it. So that it's, and so she was almost sent to jail for 8 years when her name was attached to that Apollo Soyuz test program official emblem. There were some workers actually kind of put out these certificates that sort of said, "Oh yeah, Balashova's design," and so she almost went to jail for it until she sort of persuaded people that it wasn't her fault that her name got attached to it.
That's insane. Soviet Russia really is crazy.
That's how they saw it. You're working for the state. You can't really claim credit for anything because you're being told to do it.
Fair enough.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's certainly not how we do things around here. Galina, Space Legend of the Week. It's interesting, and I think this is going to be my first of many podcasts about that design element of the humanizing of spacecraft. I think it's really important.
It's a series.
Yeah, I think so. If you're out there and you are a space architect or want to speak about space architecture, let me know and we'll have you on the show. Be really awesome to hear from you. Talking of space architecture, George, you wanted to talk about talk about more graphic design, didn't you? What did you have in mind?
I had in mind the Futura Font, which was the official font used on Apollo, the Apollo programs. So all of the UI, all the gauges and the buttons were all labeled using this font from 1927.
Yeah, 1927 as well.
The amazing thing about this font, right, it's called Futura, and it was supposed to be a font for the future. Not only was it being used in 1969, but then it's now continued to be popular, and it's still, it's still one of the main fonts. I saw this graphic designer, he made a video called something like the 6 fonts, the only 6 fonts you need for graphic design. And one of them is Futura, because it's so extensively used. If you think about Supreme, for example, the clothing brand uses the font in their logo. IKEA, up until recently. Wes Anderson as well. It's kind of a cliche in Wes Anderson films to have Futura and basically everywhere. So yeah, it really is one of those fonts that's just...
Did he set out to make it very, very clear and fast to read?
Yeah, well, it's
is that the idea?
It's a sans serif font, and sans serif means without serifs, and serifs are those flicks or things you add to letters which don't really add to the meaning, but are just sort of stylistic. So it's from this kind of German modernist school of thoughts called the Bauhaus. Or I don't know how to pronounce it, like Bauhaus or something.
No, but it is Bauhaus.
Yeah,
Bauhaus.
Yeah, yes. And their idea was basically anything, every line and everything had to be thought out and functional. And so for that reason, the font is really easy to read, as well as other things. So, which is the reason it was used on Apollo, because even if the spacecraft is spinning around and their heads are moving, you'll still be able to read the words clearly.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine how much of an influence it's had, really, isn't it? Because I guess when you look at like the sign painting and stuff like that from the Victorian era, letters look a certain way, don't they? And then suddenly you have this font based on sort of geometric circles, triangles, and squares. Like keeping it super simple but somehow also there's something pretty about it as well, isn't there? But it's unbelievably modern, isn't it? As a font, yet it's 1927.
It's really weird that it's 1927.
Now here's a little variant of it. There's a Cyrillic variant called of Futura Medium by Anatoly Muzanov, and he used it for the 1980 Summer Olympics that were held in Moscow. So even the Russians have sort of changed it. But it wasn't just NASA using the Futura font, because I mean it's literally on everything: charts, documents, instrumentation, everything. But also Boeing airliners use it for their cockpit controls.
Yeah, so it's really common for any English controls are always, for things like planes, rockets. It's a really good idea to use a font similar to that for the controls. You don't want it to be in like this really handwritten, bells and whistles handwriting, because it just won't be readable in an emergency.
No. I think Mercedes-Benz use it as well.
Yeah, and their logo.
Yeah. I said I was going to be talking about design stuff, and Julio sent over a little space fact. Did you know that the Apollo 11 mission patch doesn't have the names of the astronauts around it, breaking with tradition? So if you look at all the other Apollo missions and most other space missions, full stop, it always has the names of the astronauts around it. But because Apollo 11 was so important and so kind of iconic to all of mankind.
So timeless.
Michael Collins, obviously one of the 3 people that went to the moon but didn't actually tread on the moon, Michael Collins, the command module pilot, he designed the Apollo 11 mission patch and left everyone's names off because he wanted to represent everyone who worked towards the historic mission, thus making Michael Collins even more of a legend than he could possibly be. And he's even retweeted the Interplanetary podcast before he passed away.
Do they get to choose the position is somewhat the position that they get for the missions? I mean, did he choose to be the commander?
Deke Slayton, who chose who would go in what position, etc., and told Neil Armstrong that he was going to be the first person to go down the ladder because he thought that Buzz Aldrin was a little bit too cocky and that the public would prefer Neil Armstrong, who was this...
Preferred his first words.
Yeah. Well, it's just the fact that Neil Armstrong was a little bit more humble, a little bit more remarkable as a human being, although Buzz Aldrin is just ridiculous as a human being. Like the amount of stuff that he developed for the Apollo program. I think people just think of him as just being this outrageously good pilot who could fly a rocket to the moon. It's like, no, he's actually also, he designed things like using the swimming pool to practice spacewalks and did a lot of the orbital mechanics and stuff like that, and invented cyclers to go to Mars and stuff like that. It's like, yeah. Buzz Aldrin's absolutely genius.
Test pilots from that era, like they all have, crazy stories. Because you got to think it's like you're testing out all of these experimental jet planes. So these are like the first people to travel at the speed of sound, or the first people to go at the upper atmosphere in a plane.
Well, Neil Armstrong was. I mean, Michael Collins was a fighter pilot, so was Buzz Aldrin. But Neil Armstrong was a test pilot as well. In fact, Neil Armstrong was a civilian because he was a test pilot, where Buzz and Michael were actually military personnel, so not being paid as much as Neil. This is a little as a side issue. Anyway, before we go, George, because it's turned out into a nice long podcast in the end. God damn it, always ridiculous. I need to thank all the other Patreons. The absolute level of glory is just, I can't even contemplate it.
How much are they donating to these top ones?
More money than you can ever imagine. No, okay, so here we go. I'm not going to say that because it feels rude. So here are a shout out to my current Patreons who are absolute legends. That is the legend that is Mark Kelly, not to be confused with actual Mark Kelly, but Mark Kelly, who has a beautiful brewery in Wandsworth that you should go and visit, Sandbrooks. So Mark Kelly, Steve Croucher, Owl Broom. We have Jim King, the greatest human Swiss Army knife ever. Adam French, Ronald Hatcher, Jacob Economy, Kenton Hokanson, Gene Watchtonick, Tyrrell McAllister, Arden Vala, Tristram Hyde or Tupper Hyde, we've had him on the show, Neil Hansen, Stas Shusha, John Benak, Niklas Gillenstein, Marissa Davis, Mark Schurn, Rob Annabel, Malte Keischling. In fact, I should mention that Rob Annabel gave me the tip about Galina Balashova book. Good old Rob, actually an architect. So maybe I should get him on to help me with the architect one next time. Bob Moore, Dr. Bob Hodges, Paul Hilton. What an absolute legendary gang of people that is. If you want to join them and myself on the Discord, come and join us and join in with the conversation. George, thank you very much for doing that over in Devon and across the Zoom.
That's all right.
And I'll see you soon, Spudcats. Bye, Spudcats.
Goodbye.